Ladies and gentlemen, the last session of Track C is about to begin for the two-day Global HR Forum 2021. We look forward to your continued active participation in this session as well. The topic of this session is Labor and Human Resources Development in the Smart Economy. In the face of technology innovation, as well as in resolving the issues of industrial structure and labor shortage, in this era of the digital and smart economy, we look at the need for reforming the policies, including and not limited to HRD development. Presentations will be given by Dean Jongwon from the Faculty of Economics of Saitama University, as well as Mr. Philip Grolman, who is the Deputy Head at International Vet Comparison Research and Monitoring Federal Institute for Vocational Education and Training, or BIB. Please welcome our moderator with a big round of applause. Good afternoon. This is the last session of the two-day forum on HRD. This is the 7th session of Track C, and we'll be discussing labor and human resources development in the smart economy. We have two speakers but no discussant, so after the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. We've been given an hour and a half, so I will be able to give about 35 to 40 minutes to each speaker. But before that, let me briefly introduce to you our two speakers. Professor Woo is Korean, as you can see from his name. He's taught for a long time at Saitama University in Japan. He's currently the Dean of the Faculty of Economics. And he's also a director of JASPS, the Japanese Association for Social Policy Studies. He has served the Saitama Prefecture and City as a committee member. He has partnered with Korean scholars and research institutes to carry out various projects. And the second speaker is Dr. Philip Grolman, who hails from Germany, the Federal Institute for Vocational Education and Training. He is the deputy head of his division. He is also a professor at the university. In the past, he used to be with the Institut Technik und Bildung under Bremen University, and he worked at DIPF as well as another large research organization. Currently, he teaches at Otto von Guericke University in Magdeburg in vocational education. Each speaker will be given about 35 to 40 minutes each. We will first hear Professor Woo's presentation, to be followed by Professor Philip Grolman's presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them online so that after the presentations, we can have the questions answered by the speakers. And please specify which speaker you are addressing your question to. Now, Professor Woo.
예, 여러분 반갑습니다. 안녕하세요.
Yes, good afternoon. I am Jongwon from Saitama. I hope that we would have an informative session today. So, can I begin? Can I begin the presentation? Yes. Yes, today I will be talking about the employment system, digital divide, and digital transformation, or DX for short. The presentation that I will be providing today is a little complicated, so why don't I walk through the outline and then I will delve into the details. A lot of people say that COVID-19 is going to accelerate the pace of digital transformation, and people are concerned that DX will further cause digital divide. Digital divide is a phenomenon that is already here, and people are therefore concerned about the potential repercussions of digital transformation. However, we will come to this later, but we shouldn't just accept digital transformation as an inevitable trend. We can think of many different elements that could drive digital transformation. In terms of the speed of digital transformation, scope and the characteristics of digital transformation is going to be determined by the environment under which DX is going to happen, as well as infrastructure. On top of that, the behavior of the human resources. Digital transformation will be impacted by all of these elements. For instance, in Japan, we have a very widely spread infrastructure of optical fiber. But in terms of digital transformation, Japan lags significantly behind other developed countries. And this is because of the motivation and the capabilities of the workers. The reason is because people have propensity to not actively join in on the trend of DX. And this is rooted in Japan's very specific employment system. In Japan, they clearly divide between regular workers and non-regular workers. And that consequently drives a bigger gap between different genders, men and women. And so this created a significant gap between different types of workers, between non-regular workers as well as female workers. Female workers are not given enough opportunity and enough incentive in order to upgrade their skills. And that really is therefore holding and bogging down on the trend of digital transformation. And the digital divide is becoming worse. So today I would like to look at Japan's employment system and the trend of digital transformation and its effect on digital divide. I will explore these different topics and then move on to make a proposition as to how we could close that gap that currently exists between different groups of workers. First, let's take a look at DX. How is digital transformation bringing and causing digital divide? First, we can think of this from an occupation perspective. If you look at entire OECD countries, percentage of people who could actually who could work remotely is 70%. That's for if you are a manager. But if you have an occupation that's very simple, menial work, then that percentage decreases down to 10%, as well as for people working in agriculture, forestry, fisheries. And DX would have an impact on the industry as well. As you can see from this graph, people working in the information and communication sector, 75% of them can work remotely. But if you look at people working in construction, accommodation, and food services, less than 20% of workers can work remotely. And in the previous slide, I showed you what the percentage is for the managers and for the menial workers. If we let digital transformation continue, depending on the type of occupation as well as type of industry, there's going to be a wider gap. So that's a general trend. But let's hone in on Japan. DX. What impact does digital transformation have on digital divide? There is clear impact, but if you look at Japan specifically, there are multiple elements that impact the trend of digital transformation. Not just infrastructure, but the human resources have a significant impact on digital transformation. Now, Japan does have very widespread and high-quality digital infrastructure. According to OECD report, if you look at the ratio of optical fiber network or broadband internet in Japan, Japan has the highest penetration. So this is an infrastructure, an environment that's going to be very conducive to digital transformation. However, there's a big issue that Japan faces, especially Japan lacks IT talent. According to a survey by Ministry of Economy and Trade, as of 2018, they are short on 220,000 IT workers, and they believe that there's going to be further shortages in the future. So the human factor has impact on digital transformation as well as digital divide. A very typical example we could take a look at is the whole issue of gender divide. Now, according to a survey that was run by OECD back in 2021, out of female university students who's majoring in STEM, science, technology, engineering, of the OECD countries, Japan reported the lowest percentage of female students. And this is because there is lack of work-life balance, and also the female workers in Japan are paid less. As you can see from this graph, Japan's full-time female worker only receives about 73% of average wages that male workers receive. So from a female student's perspective, even if they invest a lot of time studying hard, later on, when they join a company and move up their career, they aren't fully compensated for the efforts that they have put in, because the female wage, as you can see, is significantly behind that of male workers. So women don't choose these types of majors or domains. I would think that the situation may be more or less the same in Korea as well between the different gender. In light of this factor, let's take a look at the current status of so-called remote working in Japan. Historically, although it's been a recent history, if you look at Japan, remote working was not really widely spread. As you can see from the bar graph, number of companies that adopted remote working or work from home is represented by blue bar, and the orange bar shows companies who are planning to implement remote working. If you look at up to 2019, less than 20% of the companies have adopted remote working. Even if you add those companies who are planning to adopt remote working, it's still shy of 30%. Then came 2020. There is a sudden surge. It's been driven by the COVID pandemic. Many companies are adopting and have adopted remote working due to COVID. But let's go deeper. On average, although overall remote working is now widely spread, if you look at the type of employment status, the type of employment, depending on the position and the status and the gender of that employees, there is a significant gap. As the bar graph shows, there are 9 bars. Top 3 are for regular workers or permanent workers. Right in the middle, the 3 bars represent out of the irregular workers, there's temporary or contract-based workers. Bottom 3, out of the irregular workers, there are part-time workers. So as you can see from this graph, depending on the type of employment status, there is a significant difference when it comes to remote working. The top 3 are male, right in the middle is female, and the one at the very bottom is total. So male, female, and total. And you see there's a difference between male and female. At the very top, if you look at male permanent workers, and if you come down to the bottom and compare part-time female workers, you will see that there is a whopping 26.5% gap between these two groups. Another interesting point is that such gap and divergence exist by different region. I currently live at Saitama City. Saitama City is located near Tokyo. So by train, it takes us about 30 minutes. And the city has about 1.3 million inhabitants. So we're quite big in terms of size. So we see a lot of companies in Saitama City convert to remote working. And if you compare that to Tokyo as well, you will see that on the left graph on the left-hand corner, companies have responded when we asked them, what will be your countermeasure? Some would say that they will shorten the business hour. There were many companies who responded that so that the employees could commute in a phased manner. And companies that responded that they will adopt remote working were only 21 companies. So that only represents 13% of the total respondent. So even if Saitama City is a quite big city and we're near Tokyo, we are not seeing remote working really spreading or becoming prevalent. And also in terms of added value, there is also a significant gap based on the value add depending in different local areas. Saitama is a prefecture. It's just like province in Korea. The data you see here is the statistics of the Saitama prefecture. Saitama prefecture, in terms of economy, is top 5 in Japan. So it's not a small prefecture. However, you will see that remote working, basically the adoption rate of remote working is still relatively low. And in the middle, you see this big blue bar. Yes, this is IT industry. For the IT sector, 71.2% have adopted remote working. But aside from IT sector, all the other industries and sectors such as real estate, their adoption rate is only 7%. Retail, wholesale is also about 7.7%. So the percentage of remote working is very low because these sectors and these industries, the amount of added value they generate is low. So let's just take a bit more closer look at added value. In Japan, labor productivity has been extremely sluggish. We are unable to really boost labor productivity. So that's a big headache for Japan. And if you think about why that is the case, since the collapse of the bubble, it's been 3 decades. After the bubble bursting, Japan's companies have been consistently cutting wages that it pays out to employees. So what happens is that for the past 3 decades, they have really used up or depleted the resources. So they do not have much leeway. What you see on the left, the bar graph, shows that in order for Japan to enhance productivity, what are the obstacles that Japan facing? What are the challenges do you think you need to overcome? That's a question that we asked people, and this is the survey result. And people responded that there is no leeway in human resources, meaning there's shortage of human resources, and financial resources are tight, and time is also tight. So for these companies, they feel that they do not have the enough leeway or slack to actually bring about improvement in terms of productivity. So the reason why Japan's system has this very perennial issue with being extremely tight on many different aspects is due to the structure of the Japanese system. So in a nutshell, this is what it is. On the right, you see digital transformation and digital divide. The relationship between the two elements, as I mentioned before, digital transformation, as it gets implemented, digital divide is going to be more widened. And if digital divide is more widened, that's going to have negative impact on the whole process of digital transformation. Here, the assumption is that, and the basis is closely related with the employment system. And in Japan, the employment status of regular workers and irregular workers, and the difference between the two is very wide. There's also a big gap between female and male workers. And in terms of region, Tokyo and non-Tokyo areas, or metropolitan area and outside the metropolitan area, show a big difference and divergence. So because of these diversions in the overall system of Japan, digital transformation is not being implemented as one would wish. And with digital transformation ongoing, that's only going to aggravate or widen digital divide. Once again, with widened digital divide, that's not going to positively feed into effective digital transformation. Well, then what should Japan do? That's the problem. What's most important is that companies, in order to narrow that gap, must exert their own effort. So companies internally would have to come up with a very integrated approach in human resources management so that they may be able to narrow that gap, and through an integrated HR management system, if they are able to create more added value, that may be a way to solve the problem. And I think this is something that's quite hopeful for Korea, and that is out of the private companies, we are seeing that there are many companies who are starting to adopt an integrated human resources management system. That's something very positive. So what they're doing is that for the female workers who used to be part-time workers, they are now converting them to regular hires. And they are converting these non-regular hires to regular workers all across the board, not being selective, but changing the employment arrangement as regular permanent workers. And there had been quite a bit of success. For instance, part-time workers in the financial institution, especially the female workers, they were mostly in charge of administrative work or clerical work. But once they become permanent workers, then from the company's perspective, the reward or compensation is not justified. So they are giving more high-level or more sophisticated work to these female workers. And these women who've now become a permanent workers are highly motivated. And so they go through training and education that's provided by the company as well as third-party outside institutions. So converting the non-regular workers to regular workers have really motivated these female workers in the financial industry institutions. And they are now tasked with more high-level work, for instance, data analysis, for instance, or sales. So there is definitely a positive impact in terms of the career development of that individual, which at the end of the day will definitely be of benefit for the company as well. From the government's perspective, they need to provide support to buttress the efforts of these private companies. For the front-runners in this area, the government needs to come up with an incentive program to subsidize these companies for their good practices or give them a tax exemption or tax benefit so that these types of plans and behaviors could be more encouraged. And another way we could think about is to actually collate all of these good practices so that such success cases could be shared across the industry. And for companies who are trying at such change but have not been able to bring good performance, we could think of providing them with consulting advice and services. So why don't I then move on to a specific case study of what's happening in Japan. What you see here is a unified employment management system. As you can see from the slide, there's this big arrow that you see. So above the arrow is the old system, and below the arrow is the new system. So at the top, that's the old system. At the very left, you see employment category. So if I were to just read this, at the very top, in Japanese, it says Sogo Shoko. This basically means a regular full-time position or full-time worker. Below, you see Senmon Shoku. What this means is a professional. This is not a professional expert. This is out of the irregular workers This is a contract-based worker who takes care of limited specific office work. Below that category is 메이트 which means part-time worker. So there are 3 layers in the old system. So in terms of the employment status, the employment contract was different and remuneration level was different. For instance, if you look at the type of employment contract for the full-time worker at the very top, the contract is, of course, indefinite. Some of the contract workers are indefinite, open-ended contract. At the very below, 마테샤인 is a definite contract. For remuneration, the full-time workers, they would get their wages or salary plus bonus. Contract workers would also receive bonus. But at the very bottom, the part-time workers would only be qualified to receive hourly wages. The range of job description for them, of course, for the full-time worker, their job range is not limited in any way. However, the contract workers and part-time workers, their job range and scope is definitely constrained or limited. In terms of upward promotion, full-time workers, there is no cap or ceiling. But if you're a contract worker, if you're a part-time worker, there's definitely a ceiling when it comes to upward promotion. On the very right, you see a pension plan, defined contribution pension plan. Only the full-time workers are eligible to receive that pension. So that is a very typical employment system that really show and clearly show the divergence between a full-time worker and non-full-time worker. So usually for a company, most of the full-time workers majority of them were men. And for contract workers and part-time workers were mostly female workers. So that's an old system. That old system now changed to a system at the bottom of the page. So in terms of employment category, everyone is just called shain, which means just regular employee. Employment contract is an open-ended, it's an indefinite contract. For remuneration, all of the employees will be qualified to receive salary plus bonus, and the job range is not limited. If you go into more detail for the part-time workers, basically there are some restrictions, but the principle is that basically to have no limit, and there is no ceiling on upward promotion, and all the employees will benefit from a defined contribution pension. So this was a significant change in the employment system and employment status. And we see more private enterprises in Japan adopting this new program. We've seen this mostly from financial companies and insurance companies, and we think that this type of a model will spread to the retail and distribution industry as well. But we don't know as to how far this new model will spread in Japan, but we are just starting to see that trend take off. If you look at financial business, the clerical work is just very manual. So the companies are now automating those administrative process or replacing that work with system. And the level of work and task has to become much more sophisticated, which means that many people need to have capability and skill to oversee that. But if you're a part-time worker or contract-based workers, these workers are not motivated enough and they are not skilled enough. So by making everyone a full-time employee, which is an institutional-based change, then we could basically elevate the type of task that needs to be performed by these employees so that the companies could be well prepared for the upcoming era. So we see the responses through such system changes. Because the private sector is the one that's adopting these changes, of course, there needs to be policy support at the government level. And this policy intervention is, of course, very important. From a mid to longer term perspective, the whole gap between full-time workers and part-time workers and the differences between male and female workers, we need to have appropriate policy measures in place so that we may narrow that gap. So that's not just about redistribution of the resources or wealth. For instance, taking more tax from high-income earners and distributing that to a low-income earners. So I'm not just talking about such redistribution model, but we also need a policy at the social level. What I mean by that is not just in workplaces, but as a member of the society, you as an individual must be recognized as that value of that one person. In Japan, part-time workers are not considered to be creating and contributing a full value as one individual. So we need to put in place a social system that will enable that. So social recognition policy is very important. So giving non-regular workers some kind of social and occupational qualifications. But such social institutional measures and installing that will take time. But the reality that Japan is facing is very urgent in many different dimensions. So if we think about some short-term measures, because the government does have to adopt immediate measures, that's one of the key aspects that the government has to think about. And in that regard, we can think of a tripartite council that involved the union, the employer, as well as the government. So, and in that framework, these entities could start to show a signal as part of this social dialogue. And this is an area that I'm really studying quite hard into, and I'm coming up with some ideas and recommendations. The idea that I have is, so within my scope of experience, Japan is quite different from Korea in that if you are a part-time female worker, out of them, there are a lot of workers who work in one single company over a long period of time, and their level of expertise is quite high. So these types of female workers, we call them core part-time worker. So these employees are called the core part-time workers. So out of the part-time workers, there are core workers. And so these people typically have about experience of 5 or 10 years of service and working at a company. If you actually go to a supermarket in Japan, if it's a big franchise, national franchise, full-time workers are only about 10%. 90% of the workers there are part-time workers. Then out of those part-time workers, if you go visit that store, the part-time workers are the ones that actually operate and manage the store. And there will be newcomers, new joiners, and people who have longer experience. Out of the people who have those long experience, from the franchise company's perspective, they would select them and use them as the store manager. So although they're a part-time worker, they perform the role of a store manager. And these part-time workers, because they are not full-time workers, their wage level is low, and they cannot be promoted up to above certain level. So that's a big social problem. So a recommendation or the idea that I have come up with is that through a tripartite dialogue, what we could think about is we could set their average wage at 1,500 yen per hour, because in Japan, average hourly wage is 1,000 yen. So if you are a fresh joiner, then they will be paid about that level. So for the core workers, although they are part-time, if we were able to increase their wage within the part-time workers, we will be able to recognize the career and expertise that these people were able to build over a period of 10 years. And so there will be multiple layers of, or different phases of wage, even if you are a part-time worker. I think with this type of system introduced, this could have quite a big of an influence and impact. And if we start to send off these types of signals, then the core part-time workers will be more motivated to further up their skills and really be motivated because they are now recognized by the society. So if we are able to try these different approach, and if we, through these efforts, the gap between the full-time workers and non-full-time workers and the gender disparities, as well as the gap that exists between different level of education of the individual, we will be, whatever it be able to narrow that gap that exists. So through a dialogue of the tripartite stakeholders, the government, the employer, and the employees, I believe that we will be able to broaden the horizon and we will be able to provide more insight to other countries as well. So thank you very much. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Wu. In this smart era, Japan, as well as Korea, is seeing the proportion of non-regular workers rising, just like in Korea, perhaps even higher than the Korean figure. And there are human factors that lead to serious issues such as the digital divide or digital transition. So companies are trying to change this, especially with long-serving part-time workers, to start introducing the solution to the problem. So that was a detailed presentation on Japan's concerns over the digital divide and its efforts to overcome the problems. Korea has its share of the non-regular workers. The gender gap is large. Wage discrepancy among companies is large as well. So that was full of implications for Korea. I believe it was informative for those seeking solutions to the Korean problem, with many implications. Now we will hear from I hope we will be given more time from the organizers. We will invite Dr. Philip Grollman to discuss the vocational and education and training in Germany for the labor market of the future. Professor Philip Grollman, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Dear colleagues, thank you very much, Jongwon, for this interesting presentation. Actually, what I'm talking about has not so much to do with such current problems as COVID and so on, but it might also have a couple of connections to your issues of long-term and part-time employment and so on, and as well on issues of technology. What I'm going to talk about to you is, as you know, apprenticeship is a very important dual vocational education and training is a very important concept in Germany, but also across Europe as a point of reference. And it has become increasingly also something which is discussed on the global level. So that's why I think it might be interesting to you what I'm presenting today. So first of all, thank you very much for providing me the opportunity to speak at this very interesting conference. And what I'm going to talk about today is based on my involvement in a couple of projects that all have an international comparative perspective. So I'm going to introduce those projects later on. And at this very beginning, I also would like to apologize for any kind of simplification I might make. This is due to the comparative nature of what I'm talking about. And then, as you can see in the title, there's also a kind of prognostic, projective perspective in what I'm talking about. And that also invites to exaggerate and make things easier than they probably are. But I hope that this might also stimulate our discussions after the presentation and raise some questions. So during this conference, the hot topics actually were digitalization, climate change, global competition of goods and services, and so on. I would like to stress that there's always also kind of a competition between different concepts and systems of employment, of vocational education and training, and so on. And yeah, we have also heard about very sophisticated technological solutions in digitalization. And then what I find interesting is that we have, at the same time, let's say over the last 10 years, an increased attention to apprenticeship, which somehow is a very old and traditional concept. So on the one hand, we have those hyper-modern developments, and we talk about the disappearance of whole sectors of work, occupations, and so on. And on the other hand, we talk about a concept that actually has its roots in medieval European continental history. So I think this is quite an interesting paradox that I'm going to play around with a little. So the question really is in how far scenarios can survive all those trends, the apprenticeships can all survive all those trends, and if they are really an appropriate solution to such a modern society and economy. So in order to be able to speak about this, I'm going to refer to a couple of works that I've been involved in. One is a 5 years project that I did on behalf, or in which I worked on behalf of CDFOP, which is the European Center for Vocational Education and Training, and where we looked intensively at the changes that happened over the last 25 years in all the European member states in vocational education and training. And then one of the final outcomes of this was scenarios on vocational education and training, not on apprenticeships. I'm going to produce or to discuss with you scenarios on apprenticeships, but what I'm talking about will be based on this research that deals with scenarios of vocational education and training in Europe in the year 2035. I will also refer to a contribution, an article that I made together with a colleague, Jörg Markovic, that based on this research of CDFOP was taking this as a starting point to think about scenarios of apprenticeships, to think about how could the future concept of apprenticeship develop also until the year 2035. And then I'm going to share with you some insights of original research that I'm doing at the moment, not least together with colleagues from Korea, from our partner institute Krivet, that deals with how work is organized in occupations in a comparative perspective. So I'm going to rush a little, so I'm not going to present the scenarios of vocational education and training. I will directly look at the scenario for apprenticeship. Sorry, was there a question or something? I heard a slight interruption. No, that not seems to be the case, so I'm going ahead. So what I'm talking about, the scenarios on apprenticeships, they are based on those overarching VET scenarios of CDFOP, but we added some own research. For example, I did together with colleagues also from Korea case studies on apprenticeships in a number of countries. You can see the countries on the left-hand, the upper left corner, based on qualitative research methodologies. All in all, we did 40 case studies across the countries, and we were looking at the question why and how would companies employ apprenticeships as a pattern of recruitment and teaching and learning in their environment. What are the basic business decisions behind that, and so on. And we also added to the overarching that scenarios and analysis of apprenticeship programs in Europe. And we came up with 3 scenarios how the concept of vocational education and especially apprenticeships might develop across Europe. And again, I say that, of course, with scenarios, we are always exaggerating a little bit. We are trying to really show up differences between different pathways. So the first scenario on the concept of apprenticeship that we have developed is called apprenticeship as a fake. So we have sort of provocative names for our apprenticeships, and this apprenticeship scenario is based very much on the idea, it's almost solely based on the idea that apprenticeship is a useful tool in order to support youth to enter the labor market. So that's the major and the ultimate goal of apprenticeships in this scenario, is that apprenticeship is a good way of supporting the entrance into the labor market for young people, but also for other people that might have problems in getting entrance to the labor market. Major players in this scenarios are the firms and the educational providers, and the type of training, the content of the training would be very general, and it would be kind of basic employability training. You would learn about work safety issues, you probably would learn about certain attitudes and so on. The firms would mainly use this model of apprenticeship for filling vacancies at the margins of the workforce in their companies, and the majority of apprenticeships would take place in rather low-skilled jobs. In a way, the firms would use this measure, apprenticeship, as a subsidized way of screening potential employees for their future work. And therefore, they would have a strong focus on early productivity of apprentices. So that would be the dominant goal for the firms, that the apprentices that they employ, they should be as soon as possible as productive as possible in the work process. All in all, we would have a situation where apprenticeship would be rather targeting, let's say, low value qualifications on the overall labor market. We always have risks for the scenarios that I'm going to present to you. And here we have the risk that there might be a certain cash and carry mentality on the side of the firms, but maybe also on the side of the individuals that make use of those arrangements. And we might also see the problem that there is not a very good coordination between different actors and between different goals of apprenticeship. So here really the major goal of apprenticeship would be the integration of people who might experience problems in entering the labor market. Then we have called the next scenario apprenticeship as a brand. And this scenario is characterized through quite a balanced way of looking at the goals of apprenticeship. It includes also educational goals. The overarching goal would be the development of professional or vocational expertise. And then there would be a rather long-term commitment of the firms. Often apprenticeships in most cases would take place in high-tech work processes, or probably very client-centered, interactive kind of service processes. Firms would see apprenticeship as a human capital investment decision, not so much as a kind of do I need more productive labor? They would look at the future and they would say, okay, I need to nurture the talent that I need for the business processes in my company. It would, in this sense, be integrated, the concept of apprenticeship, into the overall HRD policy of the company. Again, we have risks here. We would have a situation in which, because of the strong influence of the labor market parties into apprenticeship, there might be problems with articulation with the education world. So we might find us in a situation where we have, for persons who underwent an apprenticeship, a very low permeability between educational sectors and problems for people with an apprenticeship qualification to enter the world, for example, of higher education. And another risk that we might see is that because of the balanced and tripartite kind of governance that we find, we have very slow and cumbersome processes, which are not always suited to bring about the fast changes that we would like to see in light of all the big challenges that we are facing, like digitalization and so on. And then we have a third scenario, that's the last scenario I'm going to present on apprenticeships, that we call apprenticeship as a label. And here we have quite a pluralistic situation. We have a variety of logic and actors. So you can't say apprenticeship is always based on shared goals between tripartite government parties. And we do not only have labor market integration, but we really have, depending on the individual apprenticeship program, we have a variety of logics and actors, and at the same time, there might be different lengths, and the status of learners might vary, responsibilities, and so on. This also is connected to different considerations of employers. Some of them might use it as a rather long-term instrument for the development of HRD and human capital. Others use it more as a short-term instrument, and there might be a big diversity of jobs in which apprenticeships take place. And again, we also have quite different motivations to take part in apprenticeships. It could be the pure screening motive, but it can also be the increased reputation that the company has because of this, or even long-term motivations. We would see islands of apprenticeship in rather specific economic sectors, so it would not be an overarching kind of concept, but it would be related to different sectors, and within those sectors you might find the differences between apprenticeships. And the risk would be that we have a rather high fragmentation of the concept, and we might also end up in a situation where apprenticeship does not reach the attractiveness that it might, that it probably should have in society. So that's the three scenarios that we've developed. And now I'm going to add another exaggeration based on data that I would like to match with this, these scenarios on apprenticeships. So no matter if you're looking at apprenticeships, or if you're looking at the future development of jobs, it will be very important to consider in how far human learning is substantive to those futures. And that's especially the case because of the fact that in terms of digitalization, we talk about the disappearance of whole sectors of jobs, of professions, of occupations, and so on. So our idea was that it is very important to look at the dimension of learning, because learning might be something that in many cases can still best be done by human beings, and that certain forms of learning processes are associated to human beings. Of course, I know about learning technologies and so on, but learning is a very human kind of thing that is interesting to look at in terms of future developments. So in order to get some evidence on this, I'm going to show to you a couple of slides that we've made based on the PIAC survey of the OECD. And the survey, as you might know, is basically a competence testing instrument, but there's also a number of items in this survey that can provide us with information on jobs and tasks that people are doing during their work. And we have analyzed this data in regard to a couple of countries. You can see the selection of countries at the bottom of the slide. And as you can see, we have selected very different countries like Asian countries, Japan and Korea, but also Austria and Germany that represent a specific type of economy. And then, for example, UK and the US as the rather Anglo-Saxon liberal economies. And what you can see on this slide is that if you look at the question in how far workers, all what I'm going to present to you is based on a sample that only looks at blue-collar workers. That is probably important too, because we think that it is important to look at the respective occupation in comparative terms. It will not be sufficient to only look at the different countries, but we think that occupations are of considerable importance when you look at changes in the world of work, because they represent very powerful institutions and they are different from one country to another, even though they have probably the same name, like mechatronic or so. And if you look at Austria and Germany, you can find, based on the PIAC data, but also other surveys that are existing, that the German and the Austrian workers have quite a high amount of freedom to decide how they do their work. That is what you would usually refer to as discretion in the literature. So German and Austrian workers in this sample of countries are those that have the most power to decide on their own how they do their everyday work. Quite an interesting example. And we would, if you again exaggerate a little, you can say that this is probably in terms of skilled work, it's the autonomous worker type of skilled work. Then there are other items that deal with learning at work in the PIAC survey. And one important means of learning, of course, is problem solving. In your everyday work, you solve certain problems, and that might help you to solve future problems that you might encounter within your everyday work. And one item in the PIAC survey looks at complex problem solving, which basically means that you have a task in which you need more than 30 minutes in order to solve the problem. And the interesting point here is that if you look at the quantities of how much complex problem solving does appear in your everyday blue-collar work, then interestingly, the United Kingdom and the US are those economies and countries in which you'll find most of this kind of complex problem solving during work. And maybe this is also associated to a certain type of skilled work, which we call the problem solver. So that's the problem solver type of skilled work as opposed to the autonomous worker. Of course, the autonomous worker might have to solve problems and the other way around, but it's really a characteristic that you can see throughout the data. And then the last slide that I'm going to show you from the PIAC survey is in how far do you learn while working? Is there learning by doing involved in the work process? And then interestingly, it's again another country that pops out here. In this case, it is Spain. And yeah, the Spanish blue-collar workers interviewed in the PIAC survey to the strongest extent stated that learning by doing is a typical feature during their work. So this might again be another type of skilled work. It's the informal learning type. Again, the informal learning type might also be involving problem solving and some autonomy, but it's interesting that there is another country again, or another group of countries that pops up with regard to this specific item. So what I would like to discuss with you or to show to you is that there is probably, and we are still working on this, also together with the colleagues of ClimateCrisis, we have occupations and we have different ways of organizing work, not only between countries, but also within occupations between countries. So the occupation is an important unit, we think. And there might be something like different types of skilled work across the world. And maybe we can exaggerate a little and say, on the one hand, we have the skilled worker type autonomous worker. That's workers that are very, that have a lot of freedom to shape things on their own. Then on the other hand, we have the skilled work type problem solving, which we in our case found mostly in the more Anglo-Saxon economies. And then we have the informal learning, and all of those categories are important for skilled work, but it might vary in which occupations you find them, to which extent, and also across countries. On the other hand, I presented to you 3 models of apprenticeship, different scenarios of apprenticeships. And I think that the interesting question for the future is in how far apprenticeships are connected to those different models of skilled work. And based on this relationship, we will have probably different solutions and different concepts of apprenticeship. And this is basically the kind of critical point in how far apprenticeship can survive all those modernized processes. And it will be very much a topic for policy and for decision makers, of course, in the economy as well, in the future, in how far apprenticeship can survive and which of the different scenarios will be in place, let's say, in 10 or 20 years, depending on in how far they will rather look at the development of technology in terms of that they can manage this change, that there is kind of, as we've heard today several times, tripartite arrangements how to deal with those technological changes. On the other hand, we know, and there are those scenarios, that it might be a very disruptive process. Then there's probably not so much of a future for apprenticeships. Or we also might find more market-led solutions that, for example, combine, let's say, the label scenario of apprenticeship with the different skilled worker types. So that's let's say, the conclusion that I would like to draw for today, and that might be interesting to discuss with you. Thank you very much. That was my last slide. I have put a couple of references at the end in order to make sure that in case you would be interested, you can have a look at this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. It's quite interesting to match the different scenario of apprenticeship and different type of skill and learning. 지금 시간이 5시.
So we're now 5:05. We have about 25 minutes. We have not yet received any questions from the others. No, I stand corrected. I have one question. Well, actually, we have 2 questions. The first question is directed towards Professor Yu. This is a question by Mr. Lee Tae-sung. There is a background to irregular workers compared to the adoption of the part-time working arrangement and the current environment. What's the difference? And also, what's a way for us to resolve the problem of inequality or equity-related issue that's emerging in Korea with respect to the irregular workers? Another question to Professor Wu. In order to minimize the chaos that may be brought along from a transformation of the corporate system, what is the best way for the general public to actually accommodate and accept such about-face changes? And then we will separately ask some questions to Dr. Philip Groman. But these two questions were directed to Professor Wu. Can you maybe attempt to answer these questions? Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening to my presentation. And also, I will try to respond to the question. Well, in the past, we used to use a lot of these part-time workers. And why are we trying to change the irregular workers or part-time workers to permanent workers? I think that was the gist of what the question was looking for. In the past, when the part-time working system was adopted, there was the so-called informal work. More sophisticated work was handled by the permanent workers, and very simple and very clerical work was then separated, and it was given to the part-time workers. Because if you do that from the company's perspective, they could be quite, their spending in terms of wages that they spend could be then well contained. A lot of companies, therefore, have adopted the part-time system in order to minimize the labor cost. But if you look at companies, especially the financial companies and insurance companies, I've mentioned Japanese companies are adopting these new types of employment status and model. And the reason why they are resorting to such change is because of digitalization. In financial and insurance industry, this is no longer a space where only the incumbents compete with one another. There are new entrants into this space, and they are called the fintech companies. The fintechs are IT powerhouses, and they are now penetrating into the financial as well as the insurance market. So these new entrants are coming into the incumbent financial or insurance market. So the incumbents basically, unless they try to upgrade themselves, they will not be able to compete with the nimble and agile fintechs. Now, and if you look at financial market and insurance market of Japan, the market itself is fully saturated. So they want to make inroads into other countries, other Southeast Asian countries as well. In order to actually embark on global expansion, then you need to dispatch good talent to those new markets. And in Japan, there's going to be a vacancy. So they basically need to have internal talent. There needs to be a reserve of bench of people for them to actually use and to promote so that they could fill up that gap. So in the past, with a very small number of headcount who are full-time employees, then there's a limit as to how much you can respond to that. So some of the full-time workers, as they are dispatched to overseas markets, and in order to respond better and compete better to the fintech companies, now the companies need to come up with a new structure. They want to develop new products and new services, and they need that talent in-house. So I think that was the number one reason why the companies are now switching their employment arrangement. So in summary, there's fast changing and advancing technology, and in such transformative world, they used to have only a handful of part-time workers and many handful of full-time workers and a lot of part-time workers. But they now realize this arrangement is not going to be valid in this day and age. A lot of people now need to, companies as well, get used to and adapt to digital transformation. And with the older system, they now understand that that's not going to hold and be feasible in this new change. And I think that's one of the key driving forces behind the change that we are seeing. Now, what chaos or what problem can this actually lead to? It's slightly different, I guess, from with regards to the question. But one thing I may add is, if you look at a lot of Japanese companies, and when these companies adopt this new employment system, the biggest obstacle that the companies experienced was, for instance, let's say there's part-time female workers, and there were people who weren't very happy to become full-time. Let's say there's supermarket A, and the supermarket A adopted this new employment program. And in transitioning, basically, only a small number of people participated in this new system. And we asked these people why. And their response was that if I become a full-time employee, I think there's going to be more burden placed on me. There's going to be more tasks. I would have to work longer hours. Or if I become a manager, there's all the other managerial work that I have to do. And if need be, I need to transfer to another office or another supermarket. So there are all of these constraints that's going to come with becoming a full-time worker. So there was that obstacle, that resistance at the individual's level. So between the company and the workers, now this in the past was used as a pretense or justification of holding on to the older model, especially because for females, they want work-life balance. So they were reluctant to switch to a full-time worker. So that was often cited as a pretense. But this time around, the case that I shared with you was not just converting everyone or percentage of people, but it was completely changing the part-time workers, 100% of them, into a full-time worker. So when people actually then switched to a full-time worker, they experienced it and they realized that they need not worry too much. So people with the experience was able to discover that this new system actually made the employees much more happier as they become a permanent worker. So the obstacles or the problems, if only a small number of people were changed to full-time workers, that really actually created more barriers. But if this new program was applied to everyone across the board, then we saw high level of satisfaction. And when people actually experienced it, they realized that it did not task them with more burden. Well, now that was a bit of a digression. Now coming back to the question, how much of a sudden change is this? Is this what's about the fairness related or equity related problem? Within Japan, we don't see much issue on those fronts. From a company's perspective, they realize that financially this is not a big burden for them. The reason why it's not a big burden is because the part-time workers, their hourly wages have been shifted to monthly salary. And there's, of course, some additional expense like the insurance expense and benefits. But the wage level doesn't significantly actually go up. So if you survey the companies, well, there is a short-term increase in labor cost. So there is that increase. However, it's not to an extent whether it is overly excessive. And second, I do not know fully, but I know that in Korea, government-owned enterprises, when you shift to full-time workers, I know that there is a whole lot of social issue related to equity and fairness related problem. But in Japan, it's not the level of competitiveness is not as high compared to Korea. So these employees who working for financial companies or insurance companies, they just join the company quite casually, and when their status changes to permanent status, I don't think any people would raise a criticism in terms of the equity and fairness issue. So these institutional changes and system changes are happening in Japan without creating big of a chaos or shock. I think there are other companies. If you look at the advanced companies and different types of companies in different sectors, would they actually follow suit? I do not think that this new system is going to spread very quickly. This is just an example in the financial insurance sector, but if you look at retail and wholesale, the characteristics are quite different. So I do not foresee the penetration of this new system all that quickly. But with the shift to the new system, people are now experiencing that there are very positive benefits. So I do think that there's going to be some gradual expansion.
지금 답변하신 김에 한 개만 간략하게 제가
If I may follow up with an additional question. In Korea, there's discussion on regularization of constant irregular work. Is there any similar discussion in Japan, policy-wise or in other aspects?
간단하게만
No, there is no discussion on that topic because in Japan, driven by policy, changing of the employment status. Basically, the policy focus was not placed on it itself, on the restriction. So basically, between the regular workers and irregular workers, the wage level, they do not have, they had a policy to make sure that they regulate the same standard of wages. So currently, generalizing that approach is not an issue. So same work, same wage level is in place. And implementation of that policy, there's a lot of loopholes that we are identifying. So as of today, it seems like the treatment that the irregular workers are receiving is not really improving at all. So that seems to be the problem. Thank you. We'll now ask this following question to Dr. Philip Groman.
기업들은
Companies will require professionalization, digitalization, and multi-dimensional human resources, and there will be people who don't meet those requirements and fall behind. Is there enough research being done on ways to make sure nobody falls behind and are able to address the needs of companies aside from the apprenticeship? I think this question is about the people who have already been recruited. This is our first question to Dr. Groman, and there's another question for you. The first one was on ways to make sure the already recruited people don't fall behind in terms of requirements at the workplace. And the other question on YouTube is an objective assessment of the apprentice is important. So per occupation, how is the objective assessment of the apprentice and their performance done in Germany? So those are the two questions for you, Dr. Groman.
Thank you very much. I understood the second question. It was dealing with in how far or how the process of assessment of apprentices in Germany is made. I probably didn't properly understand the first question, but I tried to answer the second question first. In Germany, the assessments in dual vocational education and training, which is the German way of organizing apprenticeships, is regulated through the law, and the assessments are usually done by the respective responsible authorities, which are the chambers, for example, of commerce and industry, or the chambers of crafts, and they have examination committees that are set up with members of the occupational let's say community of practice, people that play a role in the respective occupation in the respective region, and that are experts from the field. And you also have teachers in there and people from the chambers, and they would assess, let's say, the occupational, the vocational competence of students in partly at least also practical test formats. And then in addition, you have the vocational school that gives marks to students in the with regard to the school-based instruction, just as in any other form of general education. So there's two ways of assessment, but the occupational part is assessed in a complex structure of chambers of commerce, practitioners from the fields, and teachers. I did not fully understand the first question. Maybe you can repeat the question.
Firms increasingly demand digitalized, specialized, and multi-dimensional human resources. There are some people who are not following this kind of demand. They are behind. If that is the case, what's the alternative? What's the response to this kind of problems? Is there any research on that?
Yes. Again, speaking only for the German case now.
독일에 대해서만 국한해서 말씀을 드리겠습니다.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is research on the question how
do you cope with or deal with this kind of people who are behind in terms of specialization, digitalization, and multidimensional, the multi demand by firms. Can you do you with me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Are you with me?
I wasn't sure if I should start my answer now or if I wait for.
Yeah. You can answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, of course, there is this issue of digitalization in Europe, and the different vocational education and training systems react on this. Of course, also Germany does, and I would say that there's two answers in terms of concrete initiatives. On the one hand, since work-based learning is very important in the German vocational education and training system, apprentices, learners were exposed to digitalization from the very beginning. So we had a very similar discussion in the 80s and 90s, and in terms of what does digitalization mean to office clerical work and so on. And we also had the introduction of new occupations and formats, and that's the same what's happening now. But very generally speaking, I would say that it is a specific feature of this work-based learning within regulated occupations that apprentices are exposed to the technological change from the very first day of its implementation in the work process. And that's one of the solutions. The other point is that, of course, we also have some people in the workforce who might need continuing vocational training in regard to digital technologies. And for this, the government has set up specific programs as well. But the major path is to try to design occupations as flexible as possible, to integrate the technological changes that take place immediately at the workplace and that apprentices would be then exposed to.
And I would like to add a few small questions. What happens if apprentices do not meet the standard for getting their certificate? If they fail the examinations, then what happens?
Yeah, they would need to pass it again then at the next in the next term. So they would need to stay in the program and then would get a second chance.
So their training program, their training period extended.
Yes.
Okay. 그리고
And for both speakers, there is a joint question. I don't know how relevant this is to our topic, but anyway, here goes. Which occupations will disappear and which jobs will be newly created because of the digital transition? If you could briefly share your thoughts, we'd be much obliged, especially in the cases of Japan and Germany. Professor Wu first.
Yes. Rather than directly answering this question, I think I should have probably talked about this in more detail during my presentation, but I felt that I should revisit one aspect or one topic that I was saving for the Q&A, and I actually would also like to, ask this question to Dr. Grolman and get his insight. So my hidden topic is this. I live in Saitama Prefecture. You may know this or not, but we have a sports stadium called Saitama Arena. And around the sports stadium, there's a lot of small shops and businesses. For instance, there are restaurants, there are travel agencies, and many such merchants. And at Saitama Prefecture, one of the things that we want to do is we need to implement digitalization, DX, of service industry. And we want to enhance also the service efficiency. And also, if we think about artificial intelligence and more advancement in technology, we don't know whether the service sector is going to disappear with emergence of AI or whether we'll be able to maximize efficiency of the service industry. So that's a big homework. So even if we want to do digital transformation of service industry, I think it's just going to be a model, but I don't think anything's going to happen. I don't believe there's going to be any execution. I say that because these restaurants, travel agencies, or hotels, they're all very small mom and pops shops. Maybe it's just run by one person, or maybe 2, 3 part-time workers. Of these people, around the arena, sports stadium, do they know what types of visitors come to visit the arena, the stadium? Although they can't make use of the big data or do data analytics, if we are able to analyze the data of the visitors and give the owners an insight as to what type of food dishes they should develop or what kind of travel products they need to design, we need to be able to do those data analytics. But the problem is we don't have people to do that. The biggest problem is, once again, tied with the workers, the irregular workers, because people who are working in these small merchants and small shops, they're all part-time workers. They move from one shop to another. So if you look at the human resources, basically, the government is really trying to drive DX at the service industry. So what the government wants to do and the vision that the government has, and in actuality, out on site and out in field, the capabilities that exist there is such a big gap. So there's no way we can implement digital transformation for the service sector, especially the smaller merchants in Japan. So I think this is a topic that we should all think about. And I would like to understand what insight Dr. Grolman has and what advice can you give me, Dr. Peter Grolman?
이건 발제자끼리 약간 토론식이.
So I think we're having a discussion among the speakers. But in any case, since the question has been posed to Dr. Grolman, if you can respond, we'd be grateful. Especially in Germany, when it comes to hospitality industries or food and beverage industries, if you have any experience in the influence of digitalization, we'd be much obliged.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. In fact, I was also thinking about my word that I reported about was the blue collar work. And I was thinking of, I don't know if we will have the time in how far all the things that were addressed by our Korean-Japanese colleague are also relevant for the blue-collar work in Japan, but that's another question. But it has to do with my answer as well. With regard to, concretely, with regard to hospitality, I can tell you that we have a problem at the moment with skilled labor in this sector. And there are attempts to sort of substitute this labor with machines, but it's at the very, very beginning. And I'm not sure if in such cases there is sufficient capital in order to invest into sophisticated technological solutions. So I would assume that maybe we see a certain shrinking in this sector, but I don't see really that this is going to be overtaken fully by machines. It's really a kind of an investment decision, and often in many cases it might be cheaper for the kind of business in this field to use human capital instead of technologies. But on a more global level, I think what is important for my colleagues in Germany that do research on the question in how far skilled labor can or will be substituted by technology in the future, they rather come to the conclusion of, let's say, a complementary view on machines and human labor. And in many cases, in the German developments, you would rather see the complementarity of the development of technology on the one hand and the development of skills. And let's say in terms of the enterprise production function, you always need to look at both sides in order to make a clever business decision and investment. And from a comparative view, because I told you that I'm specifically interested in the comparative view, I think that really the occupation is a very important unit of analysis. And then we really need to take into account, given all the more global projections on substitution of skilled labor and so on, that there are really within occupations, there are big differences between different countries in terms of how the work is organized. So in country A, you might have the car mechatronic, let's say, and all the tasks that the car mechatronic carries out might be in one workshop, might be carried out by 3 different people, and in the other country it might be 1 person. So we have different skill profiles of workers within, namely the same occupation, and that will really make a difference in terms of digitalization and its effects on labor. So that's my answer. But I really would be interested in how far the things that you told us about part-time work and so on are also valid for the blue-collar sector in Japan.
유정원 교수님 말씀하신 관련해서
With regard to Professor Wu's answer, I would like to participate in the discussion as well, although I am a moderator. Because of the COVID pandemic, a lot of the work that used to be done offline, especially in the food and beverage industry and the apparel industry, there's been a great change. In the US, with Amazon's business increasing, a lot of wholesale or retail shops such as Macy's in the US have either gone bankrupt or have undergone swift structural changes. And things have been accelerated in Korea as well due to the pandemic. So many clothing shops and restaurants started taking their orders online. So this is a major change. After the pandemic, maybe things will return to the past a bit, but it won't be a complete return to the pre-pandemic era. Last year, there was a survey done with one particular brand of credit card, and the research results show that the online orders had rapidly increased. In the past, I went to the South Korean city of Jeonju, where they have a large traditional market, and I told them, this traditional market will not last long. You need to analyze how much of your offline revenue has decreased and to look at how much of that has gone online, but it has to be done by another organization because the small merchants themselves can never undertake that kind of study. But in any case, traditional wholesale and retail industries will go through major changes. The individual merchants won't be able to deal with these changes. Now the question is what to do at the national level. This is a question faced by not just Japan, but other countries as well, including Korea. In the US, we see that a lot of the stores that used to be in shopping malls, especially the national franchises, the retailers have gone under or they're shutting down their branches or shops. So this hits too close to home for comfort. That's why I felt compelled to step in.
시간이 지금 35분.
So you spent We've run over by 5 minutes, so I think it's time for us to wrap up. Any last comments, very short, anything that you would like to share with us in closing? Professor Wu? Any last comments you want to leave us with? Yes, Dr. Groman, basically, your comment, and I think it closely also relate to the manufacturing industry of Japan. And the last question that we received from the audience, what occupation would demise in the face of DX? And I apologize, I wasn't able to directly answer that question. But one thing that I could say to that is that if you look at Japan's manufacturing industry, robotics and AI, once they come close to our life, that doesn't mean that all of our jobs will disappear. Companies that will become smarter by leveraging those technology will survive in the future. And there are those efforts that's ongoing, especially for service, especially customer service is also an area that we would closely think of, and the service industry as a whole. Thinking of the high-level trend, and within that industry, the individual companies would have to add more value and will find ways to survive. So it's a different dimension. I think what's important from my perspective is to find ways for us to further maximize and generate more added value and really further elevate the value of the human resources. And different ways and approaches, I think, have to be really thought hard of. Thank you very much.
Dr.
Yeah, thank you very much for this answer. And to the organizers of the conference, thank you very much for inviting me, for inviting us to this interesting exchange of presentations, discussions, and ideas.
Okay, thank you so much.
About the last question, I did a prior research regarding the occupations that will disappear in the US regarding simple office administrative work. A lot of those jobs will disappear due to automation. In other words, we will be freed from simple repetitive manual labor. But the areas that will not be replaced by automation will be primary and secondary school teachers. There is research in the US. But in any case, the availability of automated technology will determine those results. So that was just the bit of data I wanted to share with you. We talked about human resources in the smart economy. Our two speakers have approached this issue from quite different perspectives, and I think we come away with many implications for Korea. Going forward, I'm sure that Crivet will offer you access to the presentation materials. They haven't given me the presentation files either, so I'm a bit dumbfounded. But in any case, I asked the organizers to upload the presentation file so that people can access them. In closing, I'd like to sincerely thank our two speakers for their wonderful, insightful presentations. Thank you for unwavering attention and contribution till the end. To both our participants online and offline. Thank you very much.
네, 디지털 전환 등 사회 환경이 급격히
Yes, in line with the digital transformation, there are a lot of changes and transition that is required. Once again, warm round of applause to all of our three participants for this session. This brings us to the end of the program for Global HR Forum 2021. Over the past 2 days, we had speakers from many different countries engaging in passionate discussion. We also had many online and offline participants, and I believe that this was a meaningful event, and I hope that it was an informative event for you. To all of you, I hope that this forum was of help, and I hope we could impart to you with the insight that you require. Once again, we're going to ask you to give us a feedback. Please share with us your feedback and complete the survey that we will be circulating. Last but not least, I would like to thank all the participants joining us via on and offline. My name is Kim Hyun-jung. Thank you. I will see you again next year. Bye-bye.